Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. The Renaissance, as it is generally known, was a period of extraordinary cultural and intellectual development that, according to many, marked the transition from the medieval to the modern period of Western history. Based initially in Italy, the Renaissance witnessed an extraordinary advancement in the arts, the sciences, literature, philosophy, politics, the study of the classics, and many other disciplines besides, and in many ways set the stage for the emergence of modern society and intellectual life. Today, we shall be exploring the Jewish place within the Renaissance landscape and consider the ways in which these winds of cultural and intellectual change influenced the course of Jewish ideas. Joining us to discuss the Renaissance and the place of the Jews within it is Dr. Joanna Weinberg, who is Professor Emerita in Early Modern Jewish History and Rabbinics at the University of Oxford, where she taught rabbinic literature and medieval and Jewish literature and history. Professor Weinberg has written and edited numerous works on Jewish intellectual activity of the early modern period, including an extraordinary translation of Azariah de Rossi's monumental historical tract, Me'or Einayim, which he published with Yale in 2001, and which I hope to discuss with her at some point today. It is a pleasure to host Professor Weinberg on the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. If I may call you JJ, is that
absolutely may.
Yeah. It's a great pleasure to be on your podcast. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this topic. And one other point before I really begin with the subject is that in the last years, I've actually been, unfortunately, away from beautiful, sunny Italy, and I've been working in the area of Northern Europe and looking at Hebraism, forms of Hebraism in Germany, Switzerland, and England. I do hope to return to Italy quite soon because it's calling me. So this is not what we're going to talk about today, isn't research that I've been doing very, very recently, but it belongs to an area that fascinates me and I think hopefully can also fascinate other people.
Yes, I think we all have an ambition to return to Italy at some point soon. That's just generally something on our minds. But you're right, it is a very beautiful part of Jewish history, and we're looking forward to discussing it today. So, I mean, before we get into the weeds of it, let's arrive at a few basic definitions. So I actually found a rather humorous and sarcastic definition by Cecil Roth, the historian, when discussing the Renaissance. And he says that one recent writer said that the Renaissance is used to describe anything vague but splendid that happened in Italy between Dante and Michelangelo. And this is obviously a rather humorous way of putting it, but I'm hoping perhaps you can improve on this particular definition. When we say the Renaissance, what are we talking about? When are we referring to? What is going on, and why do people see this as something new?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it is very complicated, and of course, periodization is a problem in itself. How to assign time limits to eras. But I think it is possible to discern certain characteristics that distinguish one era from another. And as you yourself have already indicated, there's an enormous literature on the Renaissance. In fact, of course, there are those medievalists who would like to claim there is no such thing as a Renaissance, that all the things that people say are characteristic of the period of the Renaissance actually to be found in the earlier age. And of course, there are always little indications of things that you can find in a prior time. But I think most scholars today would accept the notion of Renaissance to describe the cultural achievements of an elite. From indeed about the 14th century to the 17th century, it is understood that it began in Italy, although Hispanists would try and claim that precedence for Spain, and it spread to other parts of Europe. And the word Renaissance to describe this period was coined in the 19th century. It was in 1860 that the famous Swiss scholar Jacob Burckhardt wrote his book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And he elaborated on the topic, claiming that it was a period of discovery of the individual. It was a secularist movement. It was a discovery of the world, secularist in thought and action. Now, his ideas have been very severely criticized and actually clearly disproved by many scholars since his time, and we shall see why later on. But the notion of Renaissance, to put it very simply, is the word that implies rebirth, i.e. a sort of calling over a revivification of the good old days of Greek and Roman civilization. And implied, as you said before, is the idea that the Middle Ages are a kind of aberration, when a barbaric time, when the high language and literature of the ancients were just neglected. And intrinsically connected with the idea of the Renaissance, apart from the artistic developments, which is not our concern today, is humanism. And that is the major intellectual movement that began in the late 14th century and came to maturity in 15th century Italy, spread thereafter in different ways, even leading to a notion of late humanism. And proponents of humanism believed in what they called the studia humanitatis. It consisted in the study and imitation of classical culture, which led to a new rhetoric, new learning, and in some cases had an enormous bearing on how you work practically, how you lead your life. In Florence, for example, major humanists filled the position of chancellor as a high position in the civil service. And for this purpose, classical texts were supposed to be the models for teaching you how to conduct yourself, how to instruct others. Now, Burckhardt didn't include either Hebrew or the Jews in his story of the Renaissance. But actually, Hebraism is part and parcel of the story. But just as humanists had to find and transcribe the lost works of the ancients, or find the best texts of the ancients, some of which had only circulated fragmentally in the Middle Ages, or simply not known at all, so too there was a great desire to ensure that the texts of the Old and New Testaments were absolutely reliable. It has rather important implications for your religious life. The Vulgate, the Latin translation of both Testaments, was now on trial, as it were. And they put it to test by comparing it to the Hebrew and the Greek originals, and also sometimes to the Targumim, to the Aramaic paraphrases. So knowledge of Hebrew and Greek was considered to be essential in many ways for Christian learning. In fact, trilingual learning was instituted in various schools throughout Europe. If I just give a few dates, because it's quite significant. In Alcalá in Spain in 1508, in the Collegium Trilingue in Leuven in the Low Countries in 1518, the Collège Royal in Paris in 1530, and 1550 in Salamanca, and in several colleges in Oxford and Cambridge. The appointment in 1540 of scriptores in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew in the Vatican Library would appear to be indicative of the new trilingual humanist spirit. So Hebrew is part of the story. Now, to recreate and imitate the ancients, the works had to be discovered, transcribed, they had to be interpreted, and the search for text continued over decades. And once the work was done and the text would be printed, and after all, the invention of printing press is part of this period that we are talking about, was very important. It didn't replace the manuscript, but it actually served an enormously important function in widespread circulation of texts. It also created a possibility of much greater controversy, certainly between Protestants and Catholics, between Jews and Jews, as we will see. So it had an enormous role to play, as it still does today.
So let me ask, you mentioned the rebirth of reading ancient texts, and certainly the renewed interest in ancient Greek, in Latin, and of course in Hebrew and the Old Testament. So let me ask, did this lead on the part of Christian intellectuals of the time into a renewed interest into Jews and Judaism? In other words, they're now learning the Hebrew language. They're now reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. So does that then lead to a reconsideration among these Italian Renaissance intellectuals of Jews? Are they now meeting Jews? Are they learning with or from Jews? Are they gaining greater understanding and appreciation of Judaism? Is there a shift in attitude? What is the effect of learning Hebrew and the Old Testament on Jewish Christian, let's say, relations of that period?
So this is a very big question, and there are many different ways of answering it. Yeah, I have to go down various different avenues, in fact, to answer it. I think one thing probably I would say for certain is that the interest in Hebrew and later on Hebrew literature, not just the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, it did not mean that the same people who wanted to study the literature of the Jews were interested in the Jews in themselves. You have stereotypes that occur throughout the literature. It goes on for quite a long time. Sometimes got worse over time in describing Jews and their sort of customs and modes of living. But one has to be very careful and know who you're talking about. In fact, the book that I have just completed with Anthony Grafton is on Johannes Buxtorf, who wrote a famous book called the Judenschule, which he wrote in 1603. Now, Buxtorf was one of the greatest Hebraists you could think of. He could read any Hebrew text, whether it's Talmudic or halachic of any sort, or belles lettres or midrashim. He could read it, and it was absolutely extraordinary, his expertise. But his book, the Judenschule, which is accurate in certain ways in describing Jewish life from cradle to grave, with a concentration only on Jewish life in Ashkenazic world, and particularly in Germany, really, or the German lands, is just a caricature of Judaism. It is a very polemical tract. Some people wanted to call it ethnography. Yaakov Deutsch has called it a polemical ethnography. We wouldn't even call it polemical ethnography, because it is so unpleasant, actually, in its tone throughout, even as he gives his readers information which, for the most part, is correct, although he goes in for hyperbole and exaggeration, so that the whole thing the description gets distorted. So that's happening in 1603, but then you've got a response to that, in a sense, by an Italian Jew, a famous Jew, Leon Modena, in Venice, who's writing his book on the rights of the Jews. And there it is a kind of response to show, Jews are not superstitious. And it's a kind of trying to attempt to sanitize the account of Jewish rights. But that takes us into a later period. But just to say that, in a way, you have to take every case on its own. And that, on the whole, though, I would say that the interest in Hebrew and Hebrew literature didn't mean that people were interested in Jews in themselves, and that they became friends. But I have one example that I wish to bring at some point today, which tells you a different story. So there were Jews, and there were also converts from Judaism to Christianity who served as teachers to Jews in this period. And we simply really don't know very much what kind of relationship that was. Before we started the podcast, you talked about Elijah Levita, Bachor. Now, he's an amazing scholar who came from Germany, came to Italy. What did he do? He went and he stayed for some years with Egidio da Viterbo and lived in his house. What did he eat? We don't know. What did he do on Shabbat? We don't know. But we know that he taught him and that he transcribed texts at the time. We know then that he went, after the sack of Rome, he went to Venice. And in Venice, he worked in the printing shop of Daniel Bomberg, the most important printer of Hebrew books at the time. And then from there, he went from the Catholic world to Germany, to Izny, to work with Paulus Fagius, a Protestant printer and Hebraist. And he worked together with him and produced his own books and worked together with Fagius. He then finally came back to Venice, and he was buried in the Jewish cemetery on the Lido in Venice. Although, there were reports that he had converted, but he didn't. It was his grandson, Eliano, who did actually finally convert. So if you take the example of Levita, the question is, there he is, he's a teacher to Christians, he's communicating with them the whole time, and he's and different kinds of Christians, one in a Catholic context, one in a Protestant context. We simply don't know what goes on between them. Clearly, Levita, for Christians, and not only the ones who knew him, that he served as the great grammarian, the great Hebraist of all time. And so people like Sebastian Münster, great Hebraist in Basel, translated his works into Latin. So to go back to your question, there are many different ways of looking at the contact between Jews and Christians at this time. And there are exceptions. May I talk about the exception, or would you?
Sure, go ahead. I mean, there's so much we want to discuss today, but this is actually an important avenue to go down because, well, before we get to sort of Jewish contributions to the Renaissance, it is important to note that the Renaissance included this, say, return to the sources, and how did that manifest practically between Jews and Christians? This is a very important part of the Jewish Renaissance story. So, please, Levita is definitely one exception, but what others did you have in mind?
Well, I have one particular story, and it doesn't happen in Italy itself. So pardon me, I'm going to go outside Italy, but it does involve one great rabbi, the Maharal of Prague, and one great scholar who was also a diplomat called Jacques Bonga, a Huguenot scholar, who was a great classical scholar and a diplomat. And he's there, it's the late 16th century. But we sort of said that it's very difficult to set a limit to your time period. But this man was a great scholar of classics, and he goes on an expedition. His really a purpose is to get to Constantinople, to get to Istanbul. But he stops in Prague, and he's traveling with a companion. And I found in an amazing coincidence, and in an album amicorum, that's one of those albums, I don't know if you did it when you were young and a child leaving school, and then you have people signing your book to say what a nice person you are, a little poem to you. That's something that was very characteristic of that period, or even in my own time, we had a little book that people put little notes in. Anyway, the album amicorum that belonged to Jacques Bonga was found by a German scholar, Walter Ludwig, some years ago, and in it was a Hebrew text. And that Hebrew text was, for me, the most revolutionary moment in my life, in my scholarly life, because it was a letter in which the writer, certain Judah Seligman, said that Bonga and his mates came to Maharal and said to him, "We want to study Hebrew." Now, if you've ever read Maharal's writings, you will know that Maharal doesn't have much space for Goyim in his work. On the contrary, Not only they're very low down in the scheme of things, and not only that, they're very clear statements of his with regard to teaching Torah to Goyim. Very, very strong.
Not the most universalistic Jew we ever had.
No, exactly. So what happens? They go to the so-called the Klois. So that's Maharal's sort of higher academy. And he goes to him and he says, may I study in your Klois? And Maharal says, come in. And he selects this Judah Seligman, who was obviously in his sort of, higher sort of echelons of the yeshiva there. And he said, go and teach them Hebrew. And what the man writes in this Judah Seligman in Hebrew, in the album, says, and they came and they studied with me Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, prophets, the whole of Tanakh, for 3 months. And we became friends.
Wow.
And it was a very important time for us all. And so when he wanted to put a sign of a friendship in this book. Now, I was completely amazed when I found this text, because it destroyed all your presumptions or presuppositions completely. Maharal, the one who's so anti-Gentile, is now saying to somebody, come in, study. And Bonga, we never knew that he knew that he was interested in Hebrew. So it also tells us about that. But for me, what comes out so strongly is that question that there they were studying together for 3 months and the deep friendship that results from that. And so I assume that there are many other examples. So if we go back to, say, Florence and to Pico della Mirandola, you mentioned Pico della Mirandola before, and his studies with 2 Jews and 1 convert, to Johann Alamano and Elijah Medigo and Flavius Mithridates. Who knows what kind of relationship he had with them? So, yeah, that's the answer to that.
So it seems to be that you're saying that through this sort of renaissance of let's say textual interest, we can definitely see evidence of interactions between many Christian intellectuals and Jews, although how positive and how friendly they were, let's say, is not necessarily so evident, even though we have evidence like this from the Maharal of Prague, where there does seem to have been genuine friendship, genuine exchange of ideas, and it's very interesting. So let me get to the main question that I wanted to really try and dig deep into today, which is, to what extent was there a Jewish component to the Renaissance? What I mean by this is, are there Jewish texts, Jewish ideas, Jewish intellectuals that we can see have a definite Renaissance stamp to them? That this is the Jewish part of the Renaissance. They are writing in Renaissance genres or using Renaissance techniques or have similar interests to those of the Christian intellectuals of the Renaissance. Could you perhaps paint a picture of that world to the extent that it exists? Was there a Jewish component intellectually to the Renaissance?
There certainly was. So I can
Good.
answer that in the affirmative to begin with. There are many examples, I think. The examples on the whole come from Italy. That's where we are at the moment. And they take different forms and styles. Let me go back to an early case. But in order to do that, let me first of all talk about what I think is something characteristic of the kind of erudition we're dealing with, which is a desire for authenticity, for correct texts, for basically a search for things which are precise and historically correct. And the person who indeed, the humanist who propounds this very much is Valla, Lorenzo Valla of the 15th century. And what does he do? He goes along and among his many things, he denounces the so-called donation of Constantine, the donation of Constantine, which gave political authority over the Western Empire to the Pope. And by means of a sort of historical expertise, but also clear examination of the Latin of the text, he's able to denounce it. And of course, this has enormous political implications. Now, the same Valla was interested in rhetoric, And he was also one of the first to be very appreciative of the discovery of the Roman rhetorician Quintilian. Now, Renaissance Quintilian Instituto Oratorio, is the institutes of oratory, were not really known properly, and there was anyway a fragmentary knowledge of the text in Middle Ages. But in 1416, the Italian humanist Poggio Bacciolini discovered it in St. Gallen in Switzerland. And there he found it in a monastery, but the Germans realized how important that text was, and they made him sit there for 54 days and write out the manuscript. But once he got that manuscript, once he got the text, it circulated. Valla saw it, and he wrote commentaries on it. And one of the people who makes very good use of Quintilian is a certain Judah Messe-Leon, who is a rabbi. He has a yeshiva. He's translating medieval philosophical commentaries, and he produces what I consider to be one of the most outstanding works of Renaissance, to answer your question. And it's called the Nofet Sufim, the drippings of the honeycomb. And in that work, what he's trying to set out to do is to argue that the rules and the regulations of rhetoric are at play in the biblical text, in the Hebrew biblical text. And he, in a very unwieldy text, full of biblical quotations from beginning to end, the man sort of uses Quintilian, Cicero, pseudo-Cicero, also lots of medieval texts to show how that works. And Quintilian's text was also an educational treatise. So it has practical implications, just as, you had to study rhetoric to be able to know how you work in public life. This is exactly what Judah Messe-Leon wanted to do by writing this text. He had to find a vocabulary to describe those formulae that you had in the rhetorical handbooks. Now, this book was printed in his own lifetime. It was the first Hebrew book to be printed in the lifetime of an author in 1475 in Mantua by the printer Abraham Conat. And Abraham Conat was very proud of using movable type. And he says, the colophon right at the end of the work, he says, I, Abraham Conat, I'm writing with many pens and not working miracles. So he's obviously very clear that he's at the beginning of the printing.
1475 is very early in the printing revolution.
It's very early for Hebrew books, indeed. So Messe-Leon's work is indeed something that is certainly parallel to some of what's happening in the Christian world. But what is interesting, and I think one should take note of this, Roberto Bonfil, who's of course one of the big scholars of Renaissance, has argued about Messe-Leon, but this is a very conservative man, and he was halachically, he was extremely conservative. He was quite strict in his decisions. Interestingly enough, he was the one who put a ban on the edition of Ralbag Gesonides, the Provençal commentator of the Bible, which was published around the same time as his Nofet Sufim, also by Conat in Mantua. And he put a ban on people reading it. Now, he wasn't very successful, because somebody has found that in a copy of this Incunabulum, this 1475 or 1476 edition of Gesonides, was possessed by some of the students of Sforno, another Italian important philosopher in the beginning of the 16th century. And they were writing notes in the lessons of Sforno in their edition of Ralbag or Gesonides. So the ban obviously wasn't very successful. But indeed, it was interesting because, if I may just go on just one little bit more about that, is that the sort of ambivalence about Gersonides was also reflected in Christian world. So later on, in the late 16th century, when censors are looking at Gersonides, there's some who want to censor him quite heavily, and there are others saying, "Oh, he's okay." And it's a similar kind of approach that you get in the Jewish world. So it depends whether, you believe in God's knowledge of the particulars, or it's not quite clear what the heretical aspects of Gersonides really did or were disturbing to Ralbag. Different scholars have different opinions. But so in one and the same person, this is what I really want to say, is you've got, on the one hand, taking in the complete sort of absorption in the general culture of the time, the reading of those rhetorical treatises, not just the medieval ones, but the ones that have just been discovered, and using them for his own sort of display of the rhetoric of the Bible. And on the other hand, the same person can be quite conservative and closed in his attitude to other things.
Let me ask, I mean, an author like that, and similar authors of his day, I wouldn't get to Azariah de Rossi in a moment because I want to focus on him for a while, but I mean, how self-conscious was it? In other words, did they have a consciousness of doing something new, right? Because they, as you say, they were using generally Hebrew, they were trying to justify it in terms of, let's say, traditional concepts, trying to, portray the Torah, portray the Jewish religion as quote unquote enlightened. I mean, I don't know what the Renaissance version of that would be, but essentially aware of things like rhetoric and aware of things like, all the other humanistic pursuits that the other Renaissance intellectuals were in fact delving into, were pursuing themselves. And the question is, were they aware of being part of these this sort of new intellectual movement or these new winds? Were they self-consciously trying to do something new, or did they believe themselves to be simply the direct continuation, let's say, of medieval Jewish philosophy, or simply the direct continuation of forms of Jewish writing that had existed for many centuries? Or did they think, no, this is something new is happening here in Italy, and we are part of that novelty? What kind of evidence is there for either of these two sides?
I think the evidence is in the work itself. I would put it that way. You can't produce something like that unless you're completely absorbed in the latest books on the market. Of course, you can find apology. So he uses, like many others of the same time, the topos that all of this knowledge was really with the Jews originally, and it was lost, and now we have to recover it and sort of reclaim it from the Gentiles. But that's just one passing statement which everybody makes a big fuss about. So that apologetic sort of statement there. But to my mind, this work couldn't come about unless you have a lifetime's absorption in the works that, not only in the medieval philosophical literature, which he knew very well, but also in the latest books in the shops. So I think he was perfectly aware that he was doing something new. Nobody had done this previously. It remains, in a sense, a one-off, a unique text. And so I can't go beyond that. I'm not going to, let's say, put into his mind what I can't prove.
Right.
But I do think what is important is to realize what it means to go and find your Cicero and your Quintilian, how much work that's involved, and how much awareness of that latest text. I just mentioned Ovadio Sforno, whose work, Or Amim, is a strange work about the reconciliation of philosophy and Torah, and he writes it in 1537, and then he does a Latin translation that's dedicated to the King of France, Henry II, and he's working in Bologna. And Andrew Burns discovered his will 2 wills, I think, and discovered exactly where he lived and who were his neighbors. And it's clear that his neighbors were Christians and that he had indeed contact with them. All the people who signed his will were Christians of various sorts. Very, very interesting document, very precious. You don't find that every day. So I think that one shouldn't think of the community at all as hermetically sealed. Jews were never living in hermetically sealed places. People like to put them there, but I don't think that ever works. That's my own sense, my own feeling. So I can't say more than I can about what he was doing, but the evidence is there in the book. Let me put it that way.
It's interesting what you say about the Jews being put into these theoretically hermetically sealed boxes. Of course, this is roughly the period, I mean, perhaps slightly later, of the invention of the Italian ghetto. And people assume the ghetto being this sort of closed off. But of course, we have evidence that some of these ghettos were places of extraordinary cultural enrichment. And the man you mentioned earlier, which we don't have time to get into, sadly, is Leon de Modena, who had local Christian intellectuals and leaders coming to listen to his sermons, because apparently he was extremely engaging and erudite and worth listening to. So there's much more there than meets the eye, let's say.
But can I say one thing about Modena and his sermons? Long time ago, I wrote an article on his Midbar Yehuda, which is his sermons, and what I discovered was that in his library he had one of those manuals on how to preach properly, and the manual was a manual written by the most important counter-Reformation Jesuit preacher. And what I've discovered was that he uses the same terms that Panigarola, that's his name, was using in his sermons when he describes what he's doing. So again, an example of a place where sermons, Christians come to the sermons. What is he doing? He's using some of the methods that were being used by the great Christian preachers of the time. It's the method, not necessarily the content, but you're applying it to Midrashim or whatever other texts you're using in those sermons.
Right. Okay, so let's move on. I mean, there's again an enormous amount to delve into, but let's do so through analyzing one very important member of, let's say, the Italian Renaissance Jewish community, a late example of this, which is Azariah de Rossi, whose massive work, More Naim, I think, comes out in your translation something like 850 pages. Quite an achievement. You must have spent an awfully long time on that.
I did.
Yeah, exactly. So let's dive a little bit into him. So give us a little bit of background, who he was, when he lived, what were the very basic circumstances of his life, and then let's take a look at the More Naim as a particularly powerful and extensive example, let's say, of Italian Jewish Renaissance literature. Who was he? If an alien landed and asked you, who is this guy? What would you respond?
Right. So from the point of view of biographical details, we have very few. We know he was born around 1511 in Mantua, very proud of his Mantuan roots. And he talks about the Tova of Mantua. That's what people did in those days. They were very happy in the cities in which they lived. We don't know much about his youth, but what we do know is that at a certain point he met a converso, Amatus Lusitanus, outside a bookshop. That's where you expect an erudite person to be. And he's with this converso called Amatus Lusitanus. That's his Latinate name. He came from Portugal. And he came to Italy, as many conversos did. And he was famous as a physician. And he met him outside a bookshop. I think it was in Ferrara, possibly Ancona. And he met De Rossi there. And De Rossi turns to him and asks him and it's interesting what they're looking at, but we will leave that for the moment. De Rossi says he's feeling very ill, and could he give him a kind of, tell him what to do? And Amatus gives a long description of the man. and how he was very frail and emaciated. It gives us a description of what he ate. It was a marvelous description. So we know what Italian Jews ate. It was a pretty good diet. And he tells him what to do and to get away from the foggy Jews of Mantua and to live in a different place. But he says, among the many things he says that he was a physician and that he was a teacher. Very vague, but that's what we know. And then we have a copybook of his, which was written out when he was about 18, which tells us the kind of things he was reading, some of which he would have been very dismissive of in his later life. It's clear that for a time he was in Bologna, and in Bologna he attended a mathematics class. And then he was probably as a result of the edict against Jews in the papal cities that he had to leave, and he went to Ferrara, and it was at Ferrara he lived the rest of his life. Now, what happened to him in Ferrara is really important, because from 1575 to 1577, the last years of his life, the Inquisitor of Ferrara tried to convert him to Christianity. And they didn't manage, but they thought he was quite a good chap, because they call him very ugly. He calls him very ugly, but really brilliant. So we can sort of try and make a picture of what the man looked like. And that he didn't speak badly of other religions, which is true. It's very clear from his Morinai. And he suspected the Inquisitor that he was one of those who circumcised Marano. So, and it's true, as Bonfil has shown, that in fact there were people in Mantua anyway who were circumcising or going through some kind of ritual of those conversos who wanted to return to Judaism. And I think it's important, because usually in the picture, when we talk about Morinai, we don't talk about what he wrote at the end of his life. And I'd like to just mention that. We can go back to Morinai in a minute, but in those years, he wrote a book in Italian, not in Hebrew, for Christians. And in that book, he used one of the Oriental languages, Syriac, which is akin to Aramaic, which was used in the Christian world, to show how the New Testament, the Hebraisms in the New Testament were really Aramaisms, and he as a Jew was showing the Christians how to read their scriptures. Amazingly audacious text. And that's what he was doing with his life in the last years of his life. And I think that's quite important to realize that. We don't know how the Christians reacted to it. There are only 2 manuscripts, and of course it was never published. But it was an amazingly courageous thing to do. And you see him as a kind of a mediator between the 2 worlds, between the Jewish world and the Christian world, constantly throughout his work.
So let me ask you about the breadth of his education, because this is something that's actually quite unusual. Reading his writings, you made aware of just how extraordinary, erudite and broadly read this man was. I mean, firstly, can you perhaps elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, what was the intellectual profile of Azariah de Rossi? But also, was this typical of Jews at the time? I mean, was he unique in having extraordinary mastery of the classical and medieval and Renaissance traditions? Was this something that Jewish intellectuals would have been expected to have at the time? How unusual was that?
Well, we are talking about an elite. And I think even when you're talking about the Christian world, it is an elite, but of course there are more of them, and so there are more products. You have to think of it in that way. He isn't the only one. I could refer to somebody, perhaps I don't know, I think we're running out of time, but Giuda Moscato, who was living in Mantua at the same time as de Rossi, the Provenzales, Abraham Portaleone. There were other people, and they had similar kind of education, not completely the same. They were reading, many of them were reading the same kind of books, but they had their own interests. De Rossi was more of a historian, Moscato was more philosophic, Portaleone was a real antiquarian, if I could use that term. So there were other people with whom he could share his interests. And in fact, I think I have an example where you can see the way when he's talking about Josephus and he's reading Josephus, and he's aware that other people, as it were, in the room are looking at different Latin translations of Josephus, because there were different translations. And so he addresses them. So you can see that there is a kind of a kind of their own academy there of higher learning. It's a small one, and it's an exceptional one, but it's not just one person. So I don't think he's unique, but I think he's one of an exclusive erudite community. Let me put it that way.
So towards the end of his life, he puts together this enormous work, the Me'orinai, which, I mean, it has different parts to it as a translation of a letter from Aristeas and others, but essentially the part that is most interesting, I suppose, is this, how would one describe it? I suppose a history of the Jewish people, but a particularly ideologically inflected accounting of who the Jews are and where they've come from, what sort of the twists and turns of the Jewish story. Can you perhaps describe, firstly, what the book is and what is he trying to do with this book? Why is he writing it? And what point is he ultimately trying to prove? Because really every Jewish history, every account of the Jewish story attempts to try and portray the subject in a certain way. So what was Azariah de Rossi's way of doing this?
Well, first of all, let me say that he is not writing a Jewish history. Okay, so that I would say straightforward. He is a historiographer rather than historian. So in a sense, his work is more that of an antiquarian rather than a historian. He is not a chronicler, so we have to put him in a different camp from that of, say, Yosef Cohen or other people whose works are Shevet Yehuda. He's not writing lachrymose work. He's writing studies of particular aspects of Jewish history that has been misunderstood or needs to be reinterpreted. And one of the main things, of course, he does, you mentioned the letter of Aristeas, which is the letter which purports to describe the translation of the Bible into Greek. That is an important element in his work, as is this Philo. He produces the first critique of Philo of Alexandria. And of course, he uses Josephus extensively throughout his work. And why does he use those three? Because they are eyewitnesses to what happened in the Second Temple period. So in a sense, yes, there is something, he is a Jewish historian in the sense that he wants to make sure that we understand, let's say, the intricacies of that world, of the Second Temple world. And what he's saying is that, if you use the rabbinic works, they didn't have enough knowledge of what was happening there, and you need to go to the eyewitnesses. So this is a good Renaissance way of looking at things. You have to go eyewitness account of the best evidence that you can have, and therefore Philo, Aristeas, let's begin with that, who describes how he went to Jerusalem, describes the temple, describes the priests. He's a jolly good eyewitness, especially when you're talking about the Big Day Huguenot. And with regard to, can I just quote to you? Please. I have a very nice quote here somewhere from de Rossi, completely on the idea of the restoration of the idea of the Renaissance, let's say. So talking, one section of the Light of the Eyes is on the priestly vestments. What do they look like? How are they interpreted? And he goes through Philo, Josephus, Aristeas, and then Christian writers and also Jewish writers. But at the beginning of that whole section, in chapter 46, he writes, "Now our blessed God has granted the people of our times to become acquainted with the writers of antiquity, who wrote in their own contexts, and with authors whose works have lain hidden and buried away from the sight of our people. It was as though they had become completely obliterated, for they were written in Greek script and language, which was not understood in the assemblies of our later sages of blessed memory.
Interesting.
Now, this is a very important point, very important. So he's using the idea of Renaissance, but changing it and making it relevant to Jews here in respect to their knowledge of Greek and the Greek writings and the Hellenistic world, the Hellenistic Jewish world, which was a specific time in Jewish history. And so he sees his role as sort of bringing back those three just like you find your quintillion, now you're finding your Philo and Greek, Philo and Aristeas and Josephus, and showing how important they are for understanding your own history.
And of course, this is in many ways revolutionary and runs profoundly counter to rabbinic history, because this is, I mean, firstly, resurrecting figures such as Philo and Josephus is certainly a significant contribution to the Jewish story in itself. But what it's saying is that when trying to write a history, one must accept the information, or the best information one can find, regardless of its provenance, right, from where it comes from. In other words, that we have many, let's say, midrashic stories or traditions that appear in the writings of Chazal, but actually the eyewitness accounts of people like Josephus and people like Philo and people like Aristeas are actually exceedingly valuable, and perhaps more so than the information that we have several centuries afterwards from Chazal. And I don't know, it seems that Azariah de Rossi is his grand innovation, really, a kind of historical realism and trying to get the best sources no matter who they are. I mean, and this, I don't know of a precedence in this in rabbinic history.
Well, I think, yeah. And what's very interesting is that, in a sense, he's discovered what became later a matter of enormous debate among Christian scholars of like Skalig and Salmasius, and later just after he's writing about what is Hellenistic Greek, what does it mean in Acts when it talks about the Hellenists. So he, just before that time, is writing about what is the significance of what kind of world was it they were living in. And from there, he goes along to produce the first critique of Philo. And this is, of course, is something that I'm particularly interested in, because it's the first critique made by Jew or Christian to say, well, what kind of man is this? He's writing in Greek. He's sort of producing allegories of the biblical texts. He seems to mess up Hebrew and Aramaic. Does he know the rabbinic halacha? Of course, he's writing before rabbinic halacha, but never mind. He seems to have some philosophical, theological ideas which are acceptable and others which are not. And so he goes and produces this kind of amazing critique over 4 chapters, trying to locate him in the context of the sects of the Second Temple period, of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Boethusians, who only appear in rabbinic texts, and the Essenes, who do not appear in the rabbinic text but appear in Philo and Josephus, Pliny. And so this is an amazing initiative of his, which obviously is reflecting on what is being talked about in Mantua by those people like David Provenzali and Judah Moscato and Portaleone. Because whereas, if I may go on to talk about Philo here, because I think it's really important, is that it seems to be a question underlying it all of identity. Who was this Philo the Jew that is being printed a lot and translated into Latin, translated into some of the vernaculars, some of his books translated into Italian, English, French, and had become a kind of honorary Christian. The church fathers quote him a lot. He is important to them. So what kind of Jew is this? What does he represent? What kind of community does he represent? And de Rossi's very careful. He sort of remains on the fence. He says, I'm not going to call him Rav. I'm not going to call him heretic. I think he's kind of an Essene, Boethusian, and he's very careful. And it's quite interesting that, and this is a man who is under fire because I don't know whether we'll get to it. There was a controversy over the book, but
right, we'll get to that.
Where his contemporaries, so David Provenzale, for example, he talks about David Provenzale, who was, he said, the first to bring Philo into the portals of the Jewish people. But I found the text of the critique of de Rossi by David Provenzale, in which he attacks de Rossi from beginning to end, really violently, and calls Philo Rabbi Filone, Rabbi Yedidya, using the same term that de Rossi uses, but Rabbi Yedidya. And he just showers praise on Yedidya, the Philo. He's like de Rossi, and this is what's important when you go back to your question about what they're reading. He clearly has read the whole of Philo in the same Latin text as de Rossi, beginning to end. But he wants to espouse Philo. He wants to make him into a halachic rabbinic Jew. And this is actually very, very interesting. So he's taking him, I think, consciously out of the Christian world into the Jewish fold. And it's interesting that Judah Moscato, again, a Mantuan rabbi, also uses Philo, calls him Rabbi Yedidya, called Filone, throughout his Nefutzot Judah, his sermons called the Dispersed of Judah, and in his commentary on Judah Halevi's Kuzari. And what is striking about what Moscato does is that he sort of interweaves Philo into his discourses. He makes him on a level with the rabbis, with the medieval rabbis, with the rabbis all together. This is the same as what Rabbi Filone said, and So you've got an extraordinary, let's say, espousal of Philo by these Italian Jews. And I think it is a quest for identity, but it's also a kind of demonstration that, the world isn't just a Hebraic Aramaic one. It can also be a Greco-Latino one as well.
It's very interesting because this particular critique of de Rossi's, let's say, resurrection of Philo comes from the Renaissance angle, almost, which is that your resurrection should have been more praising and more adulatory, that, actually what you've done is bring back to life an extraordinary and very important Jewish thinker of the ancient period. And that's, I suppose, one example of the anti-de Rossi controversy. But of course, the vast portion of the anti-de Rossi controversy came from the other side,
exactly.
Right? It came from the side that which just seemed to say that, how dare you bring back ancient Jewish thinkers who are not part of the rabbinic canon? Those who were attacking him were stating that, Philo is outside of what we consider to be, what might call canonical Jewish list of acceptable thinkers, or revered thinkers. Have I got that right?
I think, though, that the people who were attacking him were not attacking him because of Philo, which is interesting.
Okay.
So what I think is interesting is that why I thought it was important to talk about what Provenzale and Moscato do is that this is a Jew writing not in Hebrew, but they find him important because of the ideas that he has, that they feel are congruent with all kinds of Jewish ideas. So the problem with de Rossi, well, basically the problem was, of course, his position on chronology. And so what he was doing in the third part of the book, in the third part of Imre Bina, that section, he's actually bringing the evidence together to show that the conventional Jewish computation is not what people thought. So it was, according to him, at least 100 years. He was being, he didn't realize well, he wasn't in the time of Darwin. So, you can't blame him. But what he did was to show that the calculations that are used in rabbinic world or in their own time, they were conventional. Namely, at a certain point, you say, this is the dating. And he showed that also in terms of the way the calendar worked. that there is a certain point where you get a conventional era that is used, and from then, but what he's saying is that it's not accurate, it's not precise. In other words, the implication of that is that you can't say when the Messiah is coming. There was a lot of rage that in 1575, he's writing, in 1573, he's writing it, and he says, yeah, everybody thinks the Messiah is coming in 1575. Not so, because we don't know the real date. We just don't have that information. And people were very upset at that, because to them it meant that every kutubah, every get was now incorrect, because it wasn't the correct date, as it were. The people were very literal-minded in that sense. That was one of the main areas, and that's where he had to agree to, in the second printing, that Moshe Provenzali, his Hasaga, his critique, was added to the book. But then de Rossi then wrote a Teshuvah, a response to the critique. So he got his own bag. He sort of got his own position. Who writes last gets heard first, as it were. That was one area. And the second area was his interpretation of the Aggadot, an interpretation of the stories found in Talmud and in the Midrashim, which he said, or indeed, were followed the idea of sort of they weren't supposed to be taken literally. They were meant to stimulate and to bring people to devotion to God, etc. But that they weren't to be taken literally. And the famous story is the story of the gnat that entered Titus's brain after the destruction of the temple. It's the story that's always used, where de Rossi then brings all the historians and also all the scientists to show that that couldn't have happened, that a gnat couldn't have got in and then stayed there for so many years, and nor, historically speaking, that wasn't the course of events. And so people like the Maharal of Prague, whom we've already met today, got very, very upset by that. The interpretation of Aggadot was really a source of great consternation. And the Maharal of Prague, he devoted pages to denouncing the work, but he never mentions him by name, which makes it even stronger in the sense, the attack. But it also shows you how quickly, what we said before, how books get circulated. So, it's not so many years later, Maharal of Prague is reading it and is absolutely shocked by its content. But of course, Maharal's whole way of interpretation is so very different from de Rossi's. He's not a historian. And he has his own sort of ideas. The essence of the gnat is what matters. And they're just interpreting on different levels, and the two can never come together.
Which is the important thing, which is why de Rossi, I think, remains an influential, important figure to our day, because it is this historical sense, this notion that, well, we have this story in the Talmud, but hey, let's apply a little bit of a critical eye to it. Let's maybe consult some of the Roman sources. Let's see what the true cause of Titus's death actually was. And of course, this has been drastically expanded and applied with all modern contemporary historians, when they read ancient texts like that, or the accounts of the Talmud, they say, okay, one second, let's pull back a moment and see whether it jives with both, let's say, historical plausibility and the extant texts that we have. And I wanted to, I guess I wanted to end on this question, which is, to what extent could we say that Renaissance Jewish writing, as we've talked a little bit about, de Rossi and Moscato and Sforno and many others, Levita, the people we've mentioned, to what extent have those forms of writing, those forms of Jewish intellectual life continued to this day? In other words, could we say that after this period of the 1500s in Italy and elsewhere, there was something that entered Jewish letters that hasn't been taken out since, that proved enduring? I mean, I would submit perhaps de Rossi's historical sense, maybe something like that. I mean, that's an example that was picked up later. But can one say that this Jewish element of the Renaissance proved a turning point in certain respects that remained for later writers, later historians, or later Jewish intellectuals of various stripes?
It's a very difficult question to answer, as you know.
Yes.
You really.
That's why I saved it for the end. I think, if it's you could throw your hands up and say, listen, this is impossible to answer, which is
I think it's difficult to answer because there's so many different pathways of Jewish life and Jewish erudition. What I would say is that, it is interesting that de Rossi had no direct continuator, but that didn't mean that he wasn't read. He was read, even by people like Yom Tov Littman Heller in his commentary on the Mishnah. He does refer to him at one point. So the fact that he refers to him at one point means that he must have read the book, even with the kind of controversy that hovered over it. But I think that it depends where you were living. Of course, in the 19th century, in your period that you're studying, the Maskilim are very happy to embrace de Rossi, and he Leopold Zuntz said he was the first to distinguish truth from falsehood, etc., etc.
Nice. That's a good quote. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a wonderful quote. So in that sense, he became very important. Nachman Krochmal in his Moreh Nevuchei Hazman has a whole section on Philo and uses de Rossi in an enormous amount. So in different ways, his work is used. That's, of course, a much later period. And in between, there are pockets where you can see people are using it. I don't think you can make a direct link with any particular, I don't think you can say this, then there's a direct influence here, there. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't disappear and come up in all kinds of unexpected places. It's interesting, though, de Rossi is even known in Orthodox world. He's known that there's something not quite kosher about him, but they do know about him, which is quite interesting. And that means that he has had an effect, that there is a sense that what he was doing, it somehow for them pose some kind of danger, but for him, and let's end with that. For him, the thing that goes throughout his work is the idea of that the beautiful soul needs to know the truth of everything, and so that is his, that's his sort of song that needs to be sung. That whether you're a Jew or a Christian, you want to know what is right. Therefore, the rabbis would have appreciated what he did, because they would have appreciated the fact of knowing what actually happened in the time of tactics.
Okay, I think that's a stirring message upon which to end our conversation. Professor Joanna Weinberg, thank you so very much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This was enlightening indeed, and should bring about a renaissance of discussion upon these particular topics. And well, thank you. And we hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.